Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into a really fundamental question. How do organisms reproduce? We'll be exploring all the different ways life perpetuates itself, from simple cell division to the complexities of human reproduction.
It's amazing. It's one of those things, we kind of take for granted, like how did we even get here? But when you really think about the mechanics of it all, the sheer diversity of strategies, it's mind-blowing.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Why bother?
Yeah.
It's not like breathing or eating right. It's not essential for an individual to survive.
Right, you've hit the nail on the head. For an individual organism, reproduction might not seem essential. But for the continuation of a species, it's absolutely vital. It ensures that the species doesn't just disappear. Think of it like a relay race, passing the baton of life from one generation to the next.
So it's about keeping the species going, not just the individual.
Exactly. Now, that baton we're talking about is DNA. Reproduction essentially boils down to copying the DNA blueprints that contain all the instructions for building and maintaining an organism.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this copying process work? Is it like a perfect Xerox machine, churning out identical copies every time?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Cells have incredible molecular machines. They use chemical reactions to make copies of DNA, but it's not a flawless process. Imagine you're transcribing a complex recipe. A word gets misspelled here, a measurement is slightly off there. These tiny errors or variations actually turn out to be crucial for evolution.
Wait, hold on. Imperfections are a good thing. That seems counterintuitive.
Well, think of it this way. Imagine a species that's perfectly adapted to its environment, everything's going swimmingly, until the environment changes. A new predator shows up, the climate shifts, a food source disappears. Suddenly, those perfectly adapted organisms might not be so well suited anymore.
So they need to adapt, evolve.
Exactly. And that's where those tiny imperfections come in. Variations in DNA mean that some individuals might have traits that give them an edge in the new conditions. They're more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those advantageous traits.
So variation is like an insurance policy for a species, a way to hedge their bets against unexpected change.
Precisely. It's a beautiful example of how something that seems like a flaw can actually be the driving force behind adaptation and evolution.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so we've established that reproduction is about passing on DNA blueprints with some built-in variation. Let's talk about how this actually happens. We'll start with the simplest organisms, single-celled ones. How do they reproduce?
Many single-celled organisms like bacteria reproduce through a process called fission. It's incredibly efficient. The cell basically splits into two equal halves, each containing a copy of the original DNA.
So it's like hitting the copy-paste button for life.
Yeah.
Simple and effective.
Exactly. But not all single-celled organisms are that simple. Some, like the malarial parasite, use multiple fission. A single cell divides into many daughter cells simultaneously.
Why would an organism do that? Is there an advantage to producing so many offspring at once?
It's all about increasing the odds of survival. For a parasite like that, which needs to find a host to complete its life cycle producing many offspring, increases the probability that at least some of them will succeed. Think of it like scattering seeds to the wind.
A numbers game for survival. So you've got fission and multiple fission, both involving splitting. Are there any other ways single-celled organisms reproduce?
There's budding. Where a new organism grows as an outgrowth or bud from the parent, you see this in yeast and hydra, those tiny freshwater creatures.
Oh yeah, Hydra. I remember those from biology class. They had those crazy tentacles.
That's right. And with budding, that bud eventually detaches from the parent and becomes a new independent individual.
So it's like a mini-me growing right out of the parent's side. Fascinating. Now, can you define fission and budding for our listener?
Sure. Fission is a form of asexual reproduction, where a single-celled organism splits into two or more identical daughter cells. This process is simple, efficient, and allows for rapid population growth. Budding, on the other hand, is when a new organism grows as an outgrowth or bud from the parent organism. This bud eventually detaches and becomes a new individual.
Okay, that's clear.
Yeah.
Now, we've only talked about single-celled organisms so far. Can multicellular organisms reproduce asexually?
Yes, they can. One method is fragmentation. A parent organism breaks into fragments, each developing into a new individual. Think of Spirogyra, a type of algae.
I've seen those long, stringy algae in ponds. So if you break one of those filaments, each piece can potentially become a new Spirogyra.
Exactly. And it's not just restricted to simple organisms like algae. Remember those planarian worms? Slice one into several pieces, and each piece can regenerate into a whole new worm.
Whoa, that's some serious regeneration power. So is that considered reproduction?
Well, while it results in new individuals, regeneration is more about repair and survival. Most multicellular organisms wouldn't rely on being chopped up to reproduce.
Okay, that makes sense. It's more like an incredible adaptation for surviving injuries. Speaking of incredible adaptations, plants have some pretty unique ways of reproducing asexually right. They can use their roots, stems, and leaves to create new plants.
You're thinking of vegetative propagation. A new plant grows from a part of the parent plant. It's incredibly common in nature and widely used in agriculture. Think of bananas, oranges, even roses. Many of the varieties we enjoy are produced through vegetative propagation.
So it's like taking a cutting from a plant and growing a whole new one from it. And I've heard of tissue culture, where scientists can grow entire plants from just a tiny piece of tissue. How does that work?
Tissue culture is fascinating. Scientists take a small piece of plant tissue and place it in a special, nutrient-rich medium, and those cells start dividing and growing rapidly. By adding specific hormones, they can trigger those cells to differentiate and develop into roots, stems, and leaves, eventually forming a whole new plant.
It's like coaxing plant cells to build a brand new plant from scratch. That's amazing. It's particularly useful for producing disease-free plants, right?
You're exactly right. One of the great advantages of tissue culture is producing plants free from diseases, which is especially important for crops and ornamental plants.
It's like creating a clean slate for plant growth. Before we move on, can you define fragmentation and vegetative propagation?
Of course, fragmentation is when a parent organism breaks into fragments, and each of these fragments develops into a new individual. Vegetative propagation, on the other hand, is a type of asexual reproduction in plants where a new plant grows from a fragment of the parent plant, such as a root, stem, or leaf.
Okay, so we've covered fission, budding, fragmentation, vegetative propagation, and tissue culture. Are there any other ways organisms reproduce asexually? I'm thinking of that fuzzy stuff that grows on bread.
Yeah.
How does that fit into the picture?
Ah, you're talking about bread mold, which reproduces through spore formation. Spores are incredibly resilient cells that can survive harsh conditions and travel long distances. When a spore lands on a suitable surface, it germinates and grows into a new individual.
So it's like a tiny seed, but even tougher and more adaptable. And that's how bread mold spreads so quickly. Those spores are everywhere, just waiting for the right conditions to grow.
Exactly. Spore formation is a highly effective strategy for organisms that need to disperse widely and survive in unpredictable environments.
That makes sense. So before we move on, can you define spore formation for our listener?
Sure. Spore formation is a type of asexual reproduction where an organism produces tiny, resilient cells called spores. These spores can survive harsh conditions, travel long distances, and germinate to produce new individuals when conditions are favorable. This method is common in fungi and some plants.
Okay, so we've explored a whole range of asexual reproduction methods, but there's another major category we haven't touched on yet: sexual reproduction. Unlike all the methods we've discussed so far, this one requires two parents. What's the evolutionary advantage of needing two individuals to create a new one?
That's a great question. While asexual reproduction is efficient and allows for rapid population growth, sexual reproduction has a big advantage. It increases genetic diversity. When two parents contribute their DNA to create offspring, their unique combination of genes gets shuffled and mixed, leading to new and diverse combinations in the next generation.
It's like shuffling two decks of cards together. You get a whole new set of combinations. And that increased genetic diversity, as we talked about earlier, is crucial for a species' ability to adapt and evolve. But doesn't combining DNA from two parents create a problem? Wouldn't the amount of DNA keep doubling with each generation?
You've hit on a key point. If we simply combine the full set of DNA from two parents, the amount of genetic material would indeed double with each generation, leading to chaos. Nature, however, has a very elegant solution: meiosis.
Meiosis. I vaguely remember that term from biology class. Refresh my memory. What exactly is it?
Meiosis is a special type of cell division that produces germ cells, sperm, and egg cells, which have half the number of chromosomes as regular body cells. In humans, for example, regular body cells have 46 chromosomes, while sperm and egg cells produced through meiosis have only 23 chromosomes each.
So it's like cutting the DNA in half. And when a sperm and egg cell combine during fertilization, the resulting zygote ends up with the correct number of chromosomes. 46 in the case of humans. That's brilliant.
It is. Meiosis ensures that each generation inherits the right amount of DNA, preventing a runaway doubling of genetic material.
And speaking of sperm and egg cells, they're not exactly equal in size, are they? One's tiny and mobile, the other's much larger. Why is that?
That difference in size reflects their different roles. Over evolutionary time, these germ cells have specialized. Sperm cells are small and streamlined for mobility, their primary job being to reach and fertilize the egg. Egg cells, on the other hand, are larger because they contain not only DNA but also a store of nutrients to support the early development of the embryo.
So it's a division of labor at the cellular level. The sperm is all about speed and delivery, while the egg is packed with resources for the next generation.
That's a great way to put it. And this specialization of germ cells has had a profound impact on the evolution of reproductive systems in both plants and animals.
Before we get into those systems, can you quickly define sexual reproduction and meiosis for our listener?
Of course. Sexual reproduction is a type of reproduction that involves the combination of genetic material from two parents to create offspring with unique combinations of traits. Meiosis is a special type of cell division that produces germ cells, such as sperm and egg cells, which have half the number of chromosomes as regular body cells. This ensures that when a sperm and egg cell fuse during fertilization, the resulting offspring has the correct number of chromosomes.
Great. Now, speaking of plants, let's talk about how sexual reproduction works in the world of flowers.
Well, flowers, they're like nature's billboards, advertising their reproductive potential to pollinators like insects and birds, those vibrant petals and alluring scents. It's all about attracting those pollinators to do their bidding.
So the flower is putting on a show to attract those pollinators, but how does that actually lead to reproduction?
At the heart of the flower, you've got the reproductive organs, the stamen, which produces pollen, and the pistil, which houses the ovules.
Okay, so the stamen is the male part and the pistil is the female part. And those colorful petals and alluring scents are like a marketing campaign to attract the pollinators who will carry pollen from one flower to another.
Precisely. And that transfer of pollen is called pollination. It's the first crucial step in the sexual reproduction of flowering plants.
I remember learning about self-pollination and cross-pollination. What's the difference?
Self-pollination is when pollen from a flower fertilizes the same flower or another flower on the same plant. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, happens when pollen is transferred between flowers on different plants of the same species.
So it's like inbreeding versus outbreeding for plants. And cross-pollination is generally favored because it leads to greater genetic diversity, right?
Exactly. Cross-pollination, by mixing genes from different individuals, increases variation within a population, which, as we discussed, is crucial for adaptation and evolution.
Makes sense. Okay, so pollination is the first step. But how does the pollen, once it lands on the flower, actually reach the egg cell in the ovary?
That's another fascinating part of the process. Once a pollen grain lands on a compatible stigma, it grows a pollen tube. That extends down through the style and into the ovary. This pollen tube acts like a conduit, delivering the sperm cells from the pollen grain to the egg cell within the ovule.
It's like a tiny tunnel that guides the sperm to its destination. And what happens after fertilization?
After fertilization, the zygote, the product of the sperm and egg cell fusion, begins to divide and develop into an embryo. Within the ovule itself develops a tough outer coat and transforms into a seed, while the ovary surrounding the ovule swells and ripens into a fruit.
So the seed contains the blueprint for a new plant, and the fruit acts as a protective package and a dispersal mechanism.
You got it. The fruit, with its enticing flavors and colors, attracts animals that eat it and disperse the seeds, helping the plant spread its offspring far and wide. It's a brilliant strategy, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely brilliant. From pollination to seed dispersal, every step plays a vital role in the reproductive success of flowering plants. Before we move on to the next section, can you define pollination and fertilization for our listener?
Sure. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same or another flower. Fertilization is the process of fusion of the male gamete sperm with the female gamete egg to form a zygote.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on plant reproduction. Now it's time to turn our attention to the most fascinating species of all, humans. Human reproduction is a complex process involving not only biological mechanisms, but also social, emotional, and cultural factors. Let's start with the biological basics. What happens during puberty that sets the stage for reproduction?
Puberty is a period of significant physical and hormonal changes. It marks the transition from childhood to adolescence. The reproductive tissues begin to mature, triggered by a cascade of hormones. In girls, this leads to breast development, the start of menstruation, and changes in body shape. In boys, puberty brings about facial and body hair growth, voice changes, and the development of the testes.
It's like the body is prepping for the possibility of reproduction. Those physical changes are signals of sexual maturity, both to the individual and to potential mates.
Precisely. Puberty is a time of preparation, not only for the physical act of reproduction, but also for the potential consequences of that act: pregnancy and parenthood.
That makes sense. Let's delve a little deeper into the male and female reproductive systems. Starting with the male reproductive system, what are the key organs involved in sperm production and delivery?
Well, the male reproductive system is centered around the testes, those sperm factories working overtime to ensure the continuation of the lineage.
Okay, I like that analogy, the testes,
Yeah,
sperm factories. But why are they located outside the body?
that's a great question. Sperm production is highly sensitive to temperature, and it turns out that sperm develops best at a temperature slightly cooler than normal body temperature. The scrotum, that sac-like structure that holds the testes, provides that slightly cooler environment, ensuring optimal sperm production.
So the scrotum is like a built-in temperature regulator for sperm production. That's pretty ingenious. But once the sperm are produced in the testes, how do they make their way out of the body?
The sperm travel from the testes through a series of ducts. Along the way, they mix with fluids from various glands, forming semen, the fluid that carries sperm out of the body during ejaculation.
So it's not just sperm traveling solo. They have a whole entourage of fluids that provide nourishment, lubrication, and protection on their journey.
Exactly. It's a team effort. And the penis, the male external reproductive organ, plays a key role in delivering semen during sexual intercourse.
So before we move on to the female reproductive system, can you define testes, sperm, and semen for our listener?
Of course. The testes are the male reproductive glands that produce sperm and the hormone testosterone. Sperm are the male gametes or reproductive cells responsible for fertilizing the female egg. Semen is the fluid that contains sperm, along with other fluids that provide nourishment, lubrication, and protection for the sperm during their journey to the egg.
Great. Now let's shift our focus to the female reproductive system. It's often described as being more complex than the male system. Why is that?
The female reproductive system is indeed intricate, reflecting its multifaceted roles in reproduction. It's not only responsible for producing egg cells, but it also provides the environment for fertilization, implantation, and the development of the embryo and fetus during pregnancy. The key organs include the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina.
Okay, let's break that down. What happens in each of those organs?
The ovaries, located on either side of the uterus, are the control centers of female reproduction. They house thousands of immature egg cells or oocytes and produce hormones like estrogen and progesterone, which regulate the menstrual cycle and pregnancy.
So the ovaries are like the conductors of the reproductive symphony.
That's a great way to put it. Now the fallopian tubes connect the ovaries to the uterus. They're like delicate highways for the egg to travel from the ovary to the uterus. And it's within the fallopian tubes that fertilization typically occurs.
So it's a crucial meeting point for the sperm and the egg.
Yeah.
What about the uterus? It's often referred to as the womb. What's its role?
The uterus is a pear-shaped muscular organ designed to house and nourish a developing embryo and fetus during pregnancy. Its inner lining, the endometrium, thickens each month in preparation for a potential pregnancy.
So the uterus is like a carefully prepared nest, ready to receive and nurture a fertilized egg. But what happens if the egg isn't fertilized?
If fertilization doesn't occur, the thickened lining of the uterus is shed during menstruation, a process that typically lasts a few days. Menstruation is part of the menstrual cycle, a roughly 28-day cycle involving the maturation and release of an egg from the ovary, the thickening of the uterine lining, and the shedding of that lining if fertilization doesn't occur.
So menstruation is like the reset button for the reproductive cycle, preparing the uterus for a new potential pregnancy.
Exactly. It's a remarkable process that repeats itself throughout a woman's reproductive years, from puberty to menopause.
It's incredible how the female body is designed for the possibility of creating and sustaining new life. Now, before we move on to the next section, could you define ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, and menstruation for our listener?
Sure. The ovaries are the female reproductive glands that produce eggs, ova, and hormones like estrogen and progesterone. The fallopian tubes are thin tubes that connect the ovaries to the uterus, and they serve as the pathway for the egg to travel from the ovary to the uterus. The uterus is a pear-shaped muscular organ where a fertilized egg implants and develops during pregnancy. Menstruation is the shedding of the uterine lining endometrium that occurs when a fertilized egg does not implant in the uterus.
So it's a complex and beautifully coordinated system. It's amazing how the human body is so intricately designed for the possibility of creating and nurturing new life. And understanding these reproductive processes is essential for making informed decisions about reproductive health, including preventing sexually transmitted infections and unplanned pregnancies. What are some effective ways to protect sexual health and prevent STIs?
One of the most effective ways to prevent the spread of STIs is using condoms. Condoms act as a barrier, preventing direct contact between bodily fluids during sexual activity, significantly reducing the risk of transmission.
Condoms are a simple yet powerful tool for protecting sexual health. What about preventing unplanned pregnancies? What are some reliable contraceptive options?
There are a variety of contraceptive methods available, each with its own mechanisms and levels of effectiveness. Condoms, in addition to preventing STIs, also act as a contraceptive by blocking sperm from reaching the egg. Other methods include hormonal contraceptives like oral pills, patches, and implants, which work by preventing ovulation or thickening cervical mucus to block sperm. There are also barrier methods like diaphragms and cervical caps, which physically block sperm from entering the uterus.
So there's a whole range of options to choose from.
Yeah.
It's important for individuals to talk to their healthcare provider to find the method that's right for them.
Absolutely. Making informed decisions about contraception is crucial for reproductive health and family planning.
And it's important to remember that contraception is a shared responsibility, and open communication between partners is essential.
You're absolutely right. Talking openly and honestly about contraception and sexual health can help build trust and respect in a relationship.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the mechanics of DNA replication to the complexities of human reproduction. It's amazing to think about the incredible diversity of life on Earth and the remarkable ways organisms perpetuate themselves.
It really is. It highlights the interconnectedness of all living things. We're all part of this grand web of life linked by the shared experience of reproduction.
Before we wrap up, I have one final question. We've talked about how variations in DNA are essential for evolution, providing the raw material for adaptation. But what about those organisms that reproduce asexually, creating clones of themselves? Do they have any way to introduce variation into their offspring?
That's a great question. While asexual reproduction produces offspring that are genetically identical to the parent, there are still opportunities for variation to arise. For example, mutations or random changes in the DNA sequence can occur during DNA replication, introducing new variations.
So even in the seemingly uniform world of asexual reproduction, there's still a chance for novelty and change.
Exactly. And those random mutations can sometimes lead to advantageous traits, providing a basis for adaptation even in organisms that primarily reproduce asexually.
It's a reminder that evolution is a constant process, always tinkering and experimenting, even in the most seemingly stable populations. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of reproduction. We've explored the hows, the whys, and the implications of this fundamental process that unites all living things. It's been an incredible journey, and we hope you've enjoyed diving deep with us.
It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating topic with you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep marveling at the wonders of the natural world. And remember, every living thing you see, from the tiniest bacterium to the tallest tree, is a testament to the enduring power of reproduction life's way of ensuring that the story continues. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.